witness a conversation that spiraled so far out of control, it ended with security being called and a guest being escorted off-set during a live broadcast. This is the story of Russell Crowe's explosive appearance on The View, and trust me, you won't believe how this unfolded. But before we get into it, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on after you hear what went down. The studio audience settled into their seats as the show's familiar theme music faded out. The panel sat ready, coffee mugs in hand, notes spread across the table. Russell Crowe walked onto the stage with that signature confidence he's known for. Waving to the crowd as they erupted in applause, he took his seat at the end of the table, adjusting his microphone as Joy Behar smiled at him from across the way. Joy started with the pleasantries, welcoming him to the show and mentioning his latest film project. Russell nodded along, giving polite answers about his preparation for the role and working with the director. Everything seemed cordial enough. The other hosts chimed in with questions about his career, his time in Hollywood, the usual territory for a promotional interview. Then Joy shifted gears. She leaned forward slightly, that telltale glint in her eye that regular viewers know means she's about to dig deeper. She brought up a comment Russell had made in a magazine interview weeks earlier. Something about the current state of cinema and how streaming services were destroying the theatrical experience. It was an opinion piece, nothing particularly inflammatory, but Joy had a different take. She asked him if he thought his views were out of touch, given that most people couldn't afford to go to theaters regularly anymore, and streaming made entertainment accessible to everyone. Russell's jaw tightened just a fraction. He replied calmly that he wasn't against accessibility. He was advocating for preserving the art form of cinema as it was meant to be experienced. Joy pressed on. She suggested that his perspective came from a place of privilege, that someone who'd made millions from movies couldn't possibly understand what regular families dealt with. The audience made a collective sound, that sharp intake of breath that signals things are getting tense. Russell set his coffee cup down with a deliberate calmness. He looked directly at Joy and said he grew up in a working-class family in Australia, that his grandmother raised him in public housing, and that he understood financial struggle more intimately than she might assume. His voice remained even, but there was an edge to it now. Joy didn't back down. She countered that regardless of his background, he'd been wealthy for decades now and perhaps had lost touch with everyday reality. One of the other hosts tried to redirect the conversation, asking about his upcoming projects, but Russell held up a hand. He said he wanted to address this properly. He told Joy that he found it interesting how she was quick to dismiss his perspective while claiming to champion diverse voices. The audience gasped. Someone in the crowd whooped. Joy's expression hardened. She asked him what exactly he was implying. Russell leaned back in his chair, spreading his hands in a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and confrontational. He said he wasn't implying anything. He was stating directly that there seemed to be a double standard in play. Joy could express her opinions freely, but when he expressed his, suddenly it was a character flaw. Joy fired back that there was a difference between having an opinion and being tone-deaf. Russell asked her to explain how advocating for theatrical cinema was tone-deaf. Joy said it was about priorities, that while he was worried about movie theaters, real people were worried about putting food on the table. Russell's face flushed slightly. He pointed out that the film industry employed hundreds of thousands of those real people she was talking about, and that theaters closing meant jobs disappearing. The energy in the studio had completely shifted. What started as a standard celebrity interview had become a verbal sparring match, and neither participant seemed willing to yield ground. Another host attempted to interject with a light-hearted comment, trying to ease the tension, but Joy waved her off. She was locked in now. She asked Russell if he always got this defensive when someone challenged him. He responded by asking if she always resorted to personal attacks when someone disagreed with her. The audience was divided now, some applauding Russell's responses, others cheering for Joy. The producers in the control room were likely having a collective panic attack, but the cameras kept rolling. Joy accused Russell of mansplaining, of coming onto a show hosted by women and trying to dominate the conversation. Russell laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. He said he was simply defending himself against what he saw as unfair characterizations of his position. He added that if the genders were reversed, nobody would be accusing anyone of anything except having a spirited debate. That's when Joy's voice rose. She told him not to lecture her about gender dynamics, that she'd been fighting those battles long before he was famous. Russell shot back that he wasn't lecturing anyone. He was responding to accusations being thrown at him on live television. He asked if he was just supposed to sit there and smile while his character was being questioned. Joy said maybe he should try listening instead of talking over people. Russell's eyes widened. He asked when exactly he'd talked over anyone. Joy said he was doing it right now. Russell looked around at the other hosts, as if seeking confirmation of what he clearly felt was an absurd claim. One host looked down at her notes. Another took a sudden interest in her water glass. The argument continued to escalate, both voices getting louder, both participants becoming more animated. Russell stood up from his chair, not aggressively, but in a way that clearly signaled he was done being talked down to. Joy immediately told him to sit down, that he didn't get to control how this show ran. Russell replied that he wasn't trying to control anything. He was simply not going to continue sitting there while being misrepresented. The audience was in complete chaos now, some shouting for him to stay, others agreeing he should leave, everyone talking over each other. One of the other hosts, her voice shaking slightly, suggested they take a commercial break. Joy ignored her completely. She kept her focus on Russell, telling him that if he couldn't handle a challenging conversation, maybe he shouldn't have agreed to come on the show. Russell's laugh was sharp and bitter. He said there was a difference between a challenging conversation and being ambushed with bad faith arguments. Joy demanded to know what was bad faith about anything she'd said. Russell ticked off points on his fingers. First, she'd taken his comments about cinema and twisted them into being anti-working class. Second, she'd dismissed his background when it didn't fit her narrative. Third, she'd accused him of mansplaining simply for defending his position. And fourth, she was now acting as if he was the unreasonable one for pushing back against all of it. Joy's face was red now. She told him he had some nerve coming on her show and acting like the victim. Russell said he never claimed to be a victim. He was claiming to be someone who deserved the same respect that anyone else would get in a conversation. Joy shot back that respect was earned, not given, and that his behavior right now wasn't earning him any points. Russell asked what behavior specifically. Joy gestured broadly at him, as if his entire presence was the answer. She said his aggressive posture, his raised voice, his refusal to acknowledge when he was wrong. Russell's voice dropped to a lower, more controlled tone. He said his posture was defensive because he was being attacked. His voice was raised because hers was, and he hadn't refused to acknowledge anything because nobody had actually proven him wrong about anything. Another host made a more forceful attempt to redirect, practically shouting that they really needed to go to commercial. The director must have agreed, because suddenly the live feed cut, but in the studio, nothing stopped. Without the pressure of cameras, the confrontation somehow intensified even further. Joy told Russell that this was exactly why she had issues with his perspective, that he couldn't even handle one conversation without it devolving into conflict. Russell's voice was steady but cold as ice. He told her that she'd started this, that she'd been the one who turned a simple interview into an interrogation. He said he came prepared to talk about his film, to have a pleasant conversation, and instead found himself having to defend his entire worldview and personal history. Joy insisted she was just doing her job, that asking tough questions was what journalism was about. Russell laughed at that. He asked when entertainment journalism became about making guests uncomfortable rather than engaging with their work. Joy said if he wanted softball questions, he should have gone on a different show. Russell replied that there was a spectrum between softball questions and whatever this had become. He added that he'd done thousands of interviews over his career and somehow managed to have difficult conversations without them, turning into personal attacks. Joy stood up now too, matching his energy. She told him not to act like he was above it all, that he'd given as good as he'd gotten. Russell agreed completely. He said yes, he had, because he wasn't going to sit there silently while someone tore into him. Joy said maybe that was his problem, that he couldn't just let things go. Russell asked why he should let things go when they were untrue and unfair. The studio audience was still buzzing, phones out recording everything despite staff members asking them to put devices away. This was the kind of television moment that people would be talking about for years, and everyone in that room knew it. The other hosts sat frozen, clearly unsure whether to intervene or let this play out. Joy circled back to the original topic, saying that regardless of his personal feelings, His position on streaming versus theaters was elitist, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Russell's patience finally snapped completely. He said that calling someone elitist for wanting to preserve an art form was like calling someone elitist for wanting to preserve museums or libraries. Joy countered that museums and libraries were public institutions, while movie theaters were businesses designed to extract money from consumers. Russell pointed out that streaming services also extracted money from consumers, probably more efficiently than theaters ever did. Joy said, at least streaming was affordable. Russell said affordable was relative, and that plenty of people couldn't afford streaming subscriptions either. Joy said the comparison was ridiculous, that anyone could see streaming was more accessible than theatrical releases. Russell said anyone could also see that theatrical releases provided communal experiences that streaming never could. They were talking in circles now, both too entrenched in their positions to give any ground. Joy accused Russell of romanticizing the past. Russell accused Joy of being unable to see value in anything that didn't align with her predetermined opinions. Joy said his opinions were the problem. Russell said her inability to tolerate different opinions was the actual problem. One of the producers appeared from off-camera, trying to physically separate them by stepping between their positions. Joy told the producer she had this under control. Russell laughed and asked if this was what control looked like to her. Joy's eyes flashed with anger. She told him he was being childish. Russell replied that she was being hypocritical, that everything she was accusing him of doing, she was doing herself. The producer tried again to calm things down, suggesting they return to their seats and continue the conversation in a more civil manner. Russell said he'd be happy to sit down and have a civil conversation if one was actually on offer. Joy said it had been on offer until he decided to turn it into a confrontation. Russell's voice rose again. He said she must have been watching a different show if she thought he was the one who turned it into a confrontation. Joy told him to lower his voice. Russell told her to stop telling him what to do. Joy said this was her show, and she'd tell him whatever she wanted. Russell said that didn't give her the right to berate guests. Joy said she wasn't berating anyone. She was holding him accountable. Russell asked accountable for what, exactly? Having a different opinion than her. The tension had reached a breaking point. Neither was willing to back down. Neither was willing to admit any fault. And the gap between their positions seemed to grow wider with every exchange. What had started as a debate about movies and accessibility had morphed into something much more personal, much more heated, and much more volatile. The producer was now frantically signaling to someone off-camera, clearly escalating the situation to higher authorities. Joy seemed to notice this, and it only fueled her conviction that she was in the right. She told Russell that his behavior was proving every point she'd been making about his character. Russell responded that her behavior was proving every point he'd ever made about media bias and selective outrage. Joy's mouth dropped open in disbelief. She asked if he was seriously accusing her of media bias right now. Russell said he was accusing her of exactly that, of deciding before he even sat down what narrative she wanted to push, and then bulldozing through any facts that didn't support it. Joy said that was absurd, that she'd asked legitimate questions, and he'd responded by getting defensive and aggressive. Russell said her questions stopped being legitimate the moment. She started making assumptions about who he was as a person based on a single opinion about movie theaters. Another voice joined the fray. One of the other hosts, who'd been silent for most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. She suggested that maybe both of them were getting too heated and needed to step back. Joy whipped around to face her colleague, asking whose side she was on. The host said she wasn't on anyone's side. She just thought the conversation had gotten out of hand. Joy said it was out of hand because Russell couldn't accept criticism. Russell interjected that it was out of hand because Joy couldn't accept disagreement. The host who'd spoken up tried again, her voice pleading now. She said they were all professionals and could surely find a way to de-escalate this situation. Joy said there was nothing to de-escalate if Russell would just acknowledge that his position was problematic. Russell's laugh was harsh. He said he wasn't going to acknowledge something he didn't believe was true just to make her feel better about her own opinions. Joy said his refusal to see reason was exactly the problem with people like him. Russell's eyes narrowed. He asked what she meant by people like him. Joy hesitated for just a fraction of a second before saying she meant privileged actors who'd lost touch with reality. Russell said that wasn't what her tone implied, and that maybe she should be more careful about generalizing entire groups of people based on her personal biases. Joy said she didn't have biases, she had convictions based on facts and experience. Russell said convictions without flexibility were just stubbornness dressed up as principles. The back and forth was relentless now, neither giving an inch, both absolutely convinced of their own righteousness. Joy brought up other controversial statements Russell had made over the years, things taken out of context from various interviews. Russell called her out for doing exactly what he'd accused her of earlier, cherry-picking information to support a predetermined conclusion. Joy said if there was a pattern of behavior, maybe the conclusion was accurate. Russell said if there was a pattern of taking things out of context, maybe the conclusion was manufactured. A new figure appeared from the wings, someone in a suit who was clearly a senior producer or executive. He approached the table with measured steps, his expression professionally neutral, but his body language tense. He spoke quietly to Joy, but in the heated atmosphere of the studio, his words carried. He asked if they could resolve this without further incident. Joy said there wouldn't be further incident if Russell would just calm down and have a reasonable conversation. Russell said there wouldn't be further incident if Joy would treat him with basic respect instead of contempt. The executive turned to Russell, asking if he'd be willing to continue the interview if they reset and started fresh. Russell considered this for a moment. Then he asked if starting fresh meant Joy would stop making personal attacks disguised as questions. Joy bristled at this characterization. She said she'd never made a personal attack. She'd asked challenging questions that he couldn't handle. Russell said if she genuinely believed that, then there was no point in continuing, because they clearly had completely different definitions of what constituted a personal attack. The executive looked between them, clearly calculating his next move. He suggested perhaps it would be best if they called it a day, that everyone could cool off, and maybe Russell could come back another time under better circumstances. Joy immediately objected. She said Russell didn't get to storm onto her show, cause a scene, and then be invited back like nothing happened. Russell's voice was sharp as a blade when he responded. He said he hadn't stormed onto anything. He'd been invited as a guest and then treated like a hostile witness in a trial. Joy told the executive that if Russell left now, it would be because he couldn't handle the heat, not because she'd done anything wrong. Russell told the executive that if he left now, it would be because continuing was pointless when one party was completely unwilling to engage in good faith. The executive looked exhausted, caught between two immovable forces, both absolutely certain of their position. Then Joy made her ultimatum. She said either Russell apologized for his behavior and they continued the interview properly, or he needed to leave. The studio went completely silent. Every eye was on Russell, waiting to see how he'd respond. Russell's face was calm now, almost eerily so after all the heated exchanges. He said he had nothing to apologize for, that he defended himself against unfair attacks and wouldn't pretend otherwise just to smooth things over. Joy's voice was cold. She told the executive to have security escort Russell from the building. Russell didn't wait for security. He removed his microphone, set it carefully on the table, and said he'd see himself out. Joy called after him, saying this proved her point about his character. Russell stopped at the edge of the set and turned back. His final words were measured and clear. He said the only thing this proved was that some people were more interested in winning arguments than having honest conversations, and that he was disappointed but not surprised. 2 security guards appeared anyway, not to forcibly remove him, but to escort him through the building. Russell walked with them, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. The audience was in complete uproar, some booing, some cheering, everyone talking at once. Joy returned to her seat, visibly shaken but trying to compose herself. The other hosts sat in stunned silence, clearly processing what had just happened. The executive was speaking urgently into a headset, no doubt coordinating with the control room about how to proceed. Joy started to say something to the camera, to address the audience and viewers at home, but her voice caught. She cleared her throat and tried again, saying that this was an unfortunate situation but that sometimes conversations revealed people's true characters. One of the other hosts gently touched her arm, suggesting they really did need that commercial break now. As the show finally cut to commercial in the studio, the full weight of what had transpired began to settle over everyone present. This wasn't just a heated interview that got out of hand. This was a complete breakdown of the usual protocols and civility that governed these kinds of appearances. Within minutes, clips would be spreading across social media. Within hours, think pieces would be written. Within days, everyone would have an opinion about who was right and who was wrong. But in that moment, in that studio, there was just the aftermath. The scattered papers on the table, the coffee cups knocked over during the confrontation. The audience members still buzzing with shock and excitement, and the unmistakable sense that everyone present had just witnessed something that would be replayed and debated for years to come. Whether it was a justified defense against unfair treatment or an overreaction to legitimate questions would depend entirely on who you asked. And that, perhaps, was the most telling thing about the entire incident. So there you have it, the complete breakdown of what happened when Russell Crowe appeared on The View and things went completely off the rails. Now I want to hear from you.